I think we can start now.
Okay. I will first. Okay, good evening. And so today we are going to have our second lecture of the online lecture series organized by the Center of Buddhist Studies and the Glorious Sun Charity Foundation. The topic of the series is the story of Chan, history, literature, teachings, and practices. So our speaker for this series is Professor Mario Poceski. Professor Mario Poceski is the professor of Buddhist Studies and Chinese religions at the University of Florida. He obtained his PhD in East Asian languages and culture from the University of California, Los Angeles. And he has served as a visiting professor or fellow in various institutions worldwide. That includes Komasawa University, Japan, and Stanford University, USA, and National University of Singapore, and Fudan University of China, and University of Hamburg, and Erlangen-Nuremberg universities in Germany. So Professor Poceski has also published various publications. So I'm not going to read them now. So you can find his description online that's given here in our web page, as well as you can actually Google search and you can get a lot of information about Professor Poceski. He is a very popular and famous, well-known professor in the field. So today he will be presenting to you as his second lecture of the series on the life and teachings of Chan Master Mazu Daoyi. So Professor, please start.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also for organizing this, both to yourself, but also to the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong. So as it was mentioned already, this is the second lecture in the series. I gave somewhat similar lecture last month in Tallahassee. So for those of you who saw that, there might be some overlap, but also there will be different elements, and also the setting was quite different. So I hope you will still find it helpful. And of course, for those of you who are watching it for the first time, I do hope you find it informative and hopefully even inspiring a little bit. So this is again a reminder of the lecture series. The idea is basically to go through the history of Chan, mostly focusing on the Tang Dynasty, the formative kind of perhaps most flourishing period, but also going into the Sung and tracing some of the transformations over the tradition. And as we do that, of course, also reflecting of the relevance of Chan within the modern context, because this is still a major tradition of Chinese Buddhism. That is to say, it's a living tradition, even though the tradition we find today might be quite different in some respects than the traditions of medieval China that I'm talking about. So let me kind of, before I go into Mazu and his life and teaching, provide a little bit of historical context. This is kind of some of the materials I covered a couple of weeks ago when I gave the first lecture. So basically, the story of Chan is part of the story of the transmission of and acculturation and transformation of Buddhism into China. Buddhism enters China during the Han Dynasty, starting from the 1st century of the Common Era, grows, and then as Buddhist missionaries, devotees, texts, teachings, ideas filter into China, Chinese people engage with various aspects of Buddhism, and in the context of that engagement, they of course transform Buddhist beliefs, doctrines, practices, and institutions. And those are the traditions that we refer to as, broadly speaking, Chinese Buddhism. Of course, China, as it existed in medieval period, is not exactly the same as China today in variety of senses. So, and then during the Sui Tang period, so from the late 6th century and into the Tang period, Tang dynasty lasts for 618 to 907. So we have the development of traditions of Chinese Buddhism that are unique to the Middle Kingdom. And Chan is one of those, right? Traditions that maybe in some cases they claim connection with Indian Buddhism, but are uniquely Chinese. In addition to Chan, we have other traditions, Huayan, Tian Tai, you can add Pure Land, and so on. So, so Chan is part of this development of traditions of Buddhism within China, which embrace the canonical tradition as represented in various scripture treatises translated into Chinese, also by living tradition that was transmitted and developed, but also includes all kinds of innovations. And this is this kind of balance between tradition and innovation that marks this historical epoch within Chinese Buddhist history. So last time I spoke about Bodhidharma's legend and its impact on the development of Chan self-understanding, Chan ideology, Chan doctrine, and so on. And I related that also to the notion of spiritual lineage, which becomes very important. And then I spoke a little bit about some of the early traditions of Chan. So here you have listings of some of the main traditions. So we have the East Mountain tradition, the Newton School. I spoke a little bit about both of them a couple of weeks ago. Then there are others, there are Baotang, Heze School. Baotang is in Sichuan, Heze is basically not real school, but it's kind of the tradition of Shenhui and those who claim to follow, especially really Zongmi, the great Chan historian and Hawaiian exeget. And then there is the Hongzhou school of Mazu Daoyi, which is the main focus of today. I'm going to be focusing on Mazu, and then actually next week I'm going to be talking about the ideas of Baizhang, perhaps the best known disciple of Mazu and also a major representative of the Hongzhou school. So in terms of situating Mazu and the Hongzhou school within the larger historical trajectory of Chinese Buddhism, and of course with the focus on Chan, it kind of marks a kind of important transition with Tang era China. I mean, kind of historical epochs in Chinese history are debatable, and scholars have engaged in that kind of exercise. And but basically, you can say there is a notable change before and after Mazu and the Hongzhou school, and more clearly defined sense of orthodoxy, while before there were plethoras of lineages, traditions, outlooks, and so on, like the ones I just showed in the previous slide. Here we have coalescing around Chan, around the Hongzhou school, and later on we have another tradition kind of emerges that traces its ancestor Shito Xiqian, who is a contemporary of Mazu. Anyway, so Mazu is very impactful. He's important during his period. He attracts huge number of disciples, and some of them become major exponent of Chan doctrine and practice. And by and large, kind of by the early 9th century, the Hongzhou school becomes the standard bearer of Chan orthodoxy. Now, kind of, this is just a summary, but as I have written quite a bit on that. So my first book, actually, which came almost 30 years ago when I was in my 20s, was a translation of the record of Mazu, and this is Sunface Buddha. It's still in print. And then, so this is kind of more for a general audience. And then I have 2 books on, the first one, both by Oxford University Press. The first one, Ordinary Mind as the Way, is about the historical growth and the doctrines and practices of the Hongzhou school. And the second one is on Chan literature, focusing on the records, various records of Mazu, but using that as an entry point for explaining larger issues in the development of Chan literary genres, narratives, and so on, and also how that ties within Chan identity, Chan doctrine, Chan practice, and so forth. And also, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at self-promotion, but some of you might be interested to learn more, and there is that much I can cover. So if you're interested in more details about what I'm going to talk today, or really any of these 10 weeks, most of my publications are online and free access. So you can just go, there is the address there, and you're welcome to read, and if you find them useful. Much of it is kind of more academically oriented. I don't know, maybe a little bit, too technical or whatnot for some, but still, I think most of it is quite understandable as long as you make the effort to engage with the materials and so on. I'm going to talk about Chan literature later on. I have a whole lecture on that, but basically in terms of the various sources, very briefly about Mazu's life and teaching, I have them listed here. So the earliest one is from 791. It's a stele inscription composed for Mazu by Chuan Daoyi, who was a famous literatus. He was also an important politician. He was prime minister for a certain period of time. He wrote the stele inscription earlier in his career, but he was basically a very important public figure in Tang, China. And this was quite common, actually, that famous officials with Buddhist leanings will write inscriptions for a Chan master, especially, and not just Chan master, Buddhist monks in general, also Taoist priests, as a matter of fact. And this usually happens soon after the monk passes away. So Mazu passes away in 788, and this was done only 3 years after that. So we have really contemporaneous information about Mazu's life and a little bit about his idea, but mostly it's about his life following kind of the format of particular genre that was popular in China at the time. And then other materials are later. So we have Zutangji, which is a kind of, you can say, a collection of Chan materials compiled in 952. Then in 961, Yongming compiles Zongjinglu, so there's quite a bit of material about Mazu and his disciples in that particular text. And by the way, here, that's Zutangji was lost in China, and it was only discovered during the early 20th century, and this is a print of the original text that was discovered, which was in the Korean Tripitaka. I'm going to talk about these materials later on in the series. And then you find in Song Gao Seng Chuan, the famous compilation of biographies or hagiographies, if you prefer, of eminent monks, which was compiled by Zan Ning in 988. And then, of course, in Jingde Chuandenglu, the record of the Lam's transmission from the Jingde era, which is a very, very important Chan text compiled in 1004. There are a couple of places where you can find information about Mazu's life and teachings. And of course, the most famous text associated with Mazu is Mazu Yulu, which was my first book, as I mentioned, was on Mazu, included. It was not just about Mazu Yulu, but included translation of Mazu Yulu. So this is quite a later text. It's from the 11th century, but it was not written in the 11th century. It was just compiled on the basis of sources that were available. So some sources are earlier, some sources are later, and so on. And one of the works that I've been trying to do is to establish the provenance of these various sources, which texts are kind of closer, maybe can be attributed to Mazu, which are later, and how that develops, and so on. There is also all kinds of information about Mazu, and at least Mazu mentioned, I mean, not all these texts, of course, are necessarily related to the historical person, so they're texts that were compiled later and attributed to Mazu. But anyway, he features in some of these later stories and so on. So also you can find all kinds of information about Mazu in various entries of his disciples and their hagiographies. Also, various Gongan collections, B and Lu, Woman Guan, they also contain some koans where Mazu is the main protagonist. Okay, so that's about the text. And as I said, I'm going to talk about various Chan sources and textual traditions and genres later on in the series. But in terms of Mazu, let me start a little bit with his life and legacy, and then I'm mostly going to focus on his teachings as preserved in several records. So he's born in Sichuan, which is in the, I guess, western part of the south, a little bit southwest part of the Tang Empire. Sichuan is a place with a long and rich history, but also it's a place with unique culture, in part because of its geographical position in relative isolation. And he comes from probably somewhat upper class family, as is the custom, with most of these prominent monks. Usually they come from at least some of them for quite prominent families, but certainly not from the illiterate class. So they will come from like what can be referred to as gentry or upper class. And he enters monastic life while he's still young, which is also kind of common theme in the biographies of prominent monks from that period. And then during this period, already in Sichuan, his native province or his native area, there was a presence of Chan. And Mazu, so from early on in his monastic life, actually, he have Chan background. His early teacher is Juji. He's a local Chan master in the tradition of Huineng. And then Wu Xiang is a Korean immigrant monk. He comes originally from Korea, from the kind of scion of the royal family in the Shilla dynasty, and he ends up in Sichuan, and he becomes a prominent master there, and Mazu also studies with him. And then while he's still young, he decides to leave his native province. For those of us who have traveled, who have left our homelands and gone to faraway places in search of, I don't know, education, truth, meaning, adventure, and so on, I think we can relate to that. So he travels east and he goes to Nanyue. Nanyue is a mountain with long history. It's one of the 5 sacred mountains of China. And by this time also is a place where there are lots of Buddhist monks and Taoist contemplatives living in the mountain. And when he goes there, he encounters a monk whose name is Huairang. Huairang at that time is, later in tradition, he becomes an important figure, in part, not in part, but mostly because he's listed as the disciple of Mazu. At that time, probably he was quite obscure monk, kind of living in the mountain. He was a disciple of the famous Huineng, the 6th patriarch. And in that sense, you can see this kind of, and he provides this important link between Huineng and Mazu, and this is kind of becomes the main line of orthodox transmission in Chan. There are lots of historical problems about Huineng, the platform scripture, and so on. I'm not going to talk too much about it in this series, but others have written about it. Anyway, so he goes there, and we don't know exactly what transpires, but there is one interesting story recorded in some text about Mazu's interaction between Mazu and Huairang. So the story goes, Mazu is sitting somewhere in the mountain close to this small temple where Huairang is resident, and he's engaged in meditation, sitting meditation, Zuochan, right? And he meditates, and then kind of Huairang is just walking around, and then at some point, Huairang sits close to Mazu as Mazu is meditating very seriously, and he picks up a brick. I don't know what bricks in Tang China look like, but this is something I pick up. I guess I have somewhere at my home. I have some outside and in my garage. Actually, this brick have been at my home for 20 years. When I bought the house, was there. Anyway, so you have a brick. So Mazu is meditating. So here's Mazu. Like, okay, you can see the statue on the back. So Mazu is there sitting, and Huairang is sitting close to him in his field of vision. And he picks up the brick and he starts to polish the brick, like polishing the brick like this. And Mazu first ignores him because he's a very serious meditator, but after a while, he kind of curiosity overtakes him, and he looks at, kind of interrupts his meditation and asks Huairang, well, what are you doing? Huairang says, well, I'm polishing a brick. Mazu says, why you do that? What's the point of polishing a brick? Well, Huairang says, I am trying to make a mirror. Mazu apparently is surprised, like, well, how on earth are you going to make a mirror out of a brick? And then Huairang says, well, what are you doing? And Mazu says, well, I'm meditating to become a Buddha. Well, Huairang says, how you can become a Buddha by meditating, right? So this is kind of my retelling of the story. This is kind of translation of the one of the versions. There's several versions of this story. So here, Kaiyuan period of the Tang Dynasty. So here we're talking about 730s, and there's a Chuanfa temple in Hangya. That's the name. So all kind of historical information and sitting in meditation. I want to become a Buddha. Okay, I kind of mix up the sequence here in my storytelling. So first this discussion, and then but basically. Here, the idea is that just as you cannot become, it's just as you cannot make a mirror by polishing a brick, you cannot become a Buddha or become enlightened or become liberated by meditating. In some versions of the story, there's continuation, so there's some kind of instruction that Huairang gives to Mazu. So the first one is so this exchange. So kind of if you're driving an ox, and if the carriage stops moving, what do? Do you hit the ox to make him start moving again, or do you hit the carriage? Obviously, hitting the carriage is useless. So basically, you have to apply the right method. And then there is this kind of explanation. As you practice sitting in meditation, or are you practicing sitting in meditation or practicing to sit like a Buddha? As to sitting in meditation, meditation is neither sitting nor lying. You find this kind of attitude, like a criticism of formal sitting meditation in number of Chan texts. Also, there's some similar passage in the Vimalakirti scripture, Weimo Jing. So Buddha is not about particular form, right? Buddha has no fixed form. And when it comes to the Dharma, to the true nature of reality, there is neither form nor no form, neither grasping nor rejecting. If you just sit, so the basic idea here is you just sit, and you think by engaging in formal meditation or following certain technique, you will become enlightened. That's not really the way. You're basically killing the Buddha. Because it's not so much that necessary that meditation is the wrong approach, but that really this kind of fixed belief of self that can be transformed to application of certain technique that is problematic. So, and again, the last sentence attributed to Huairang, if you attach to the form of sitting, then you do not penetrate. So if you fixate on the practice itself, on the form of the technique, then you do not penetrate the principles. And then as in many good Chan stories, then Mazu have realization on the truth that Huairang tries to convey, whereas in modern Chan literature, stories or Zen stories, you will say Mazu becomes enlightened. So tasting a ghee, this is comes from scriptural sources. So ghee is the most refined of the milk products, so symbolizes the refined nature of realization of spiritual liberation. So this is a story. Whether this happened or not, there is no way to knowing, but it's kind of instructive in terms of understanding Chan attitudes towards formal meditation practice, sitting meditation, and also the application of techniques. So there are two ways you can read this story. One is the Chan, which again, as we discussed last time, means the basic meditation. So that the tradition of meditation have nothing to do with meditation as a practice or as a technique. That really is futile to meditate, because really the true nature of reality have nothing to do with whether you meditate or not. This is one kind of more a narrow way of understanding this story. Basically, is a rejection of formal meditation practice, and you can find elements of that in other Chan texts. The other interpretation, which probably is closer to reality, or more in tune with what they were up to at that time, is that really this is not so much about that you shouldn't meditate. I mean, meditation may be helpful as a practice or as a technique, but it's about the proper attitude to meditation, that one shouldn't attach to the form and shouldn't fetishize the technique. That really it's kind of one can engage in contemplative practices, including sitting meditation, if that's helpful, but within the right frame of mind, within the right attitude, without attachment, with deeper understanding of how it fits into a larger paradigm of spiritual cultivation and so on. So those are the two interpretations. You can pick up either one. All right, so going back to Mazu's slide. So while he's still young, so he probably doesn't stay with Huairang for too long. He eventually moves to Jiangxi province. And so that will be southeast China. And then by the, he's still relatively young, by the, I guess approaching middle age, he settles as a Gonggong mountain. It's a mountain in central Jiangxi province. And he establishes a monastery there, and he starts attracting a number of disciples. And then more and more disciples come to him, and he becomes better known. So his disciples, actually, I've traced in my study of the Hongzhou school where they come from, and then when they go after him, but basically have all of China covered. So from the north, from the central, of course, many of them are from the southern provinces, but you have disciples coming from faraway places as well. So he trains his disciples, become famous, and then as he becomes older, around 770, he moves to Kaiyuan Monastery in Hongzhou, which is present in Nanchang, the capital of Jiangxi province. So this is up north in the province. Kaiyuan was part of an official framework of monasteries that existed all over the Tang Empire. So in that sense, it kind of symbolized some kind of official patronage. And also we have records of some of the local high place officials also coming and talking with Mazu and supporting him and learning from him and so on. So he becomes even more famous during the final decade of his life. He attracts more disciples in Nanchang. And then in 788, in kind of at the end of the winter, kind of as spring is coming, he realizes that he's going to die, and he's after he dies, he's buried at Mountain Shilmen, which is about 80, not too far. I mean, I think I don't remember. It was it? I think it was 80 miles or something like that from Nanchang. So this will be more remote area, and this becomes his burial site. And the inscription that I mentioned by Chuan Daoyi, which was built after when they built pagoda to commemorate his life and legacy after he died. So it was composed for this particular place, and so he's buried there. There is a story. Before I go to the story, so the monastery in Nanchang or Hongzhou have long, complicated history. And this actually, if there is a young graduate student or somebody this might be interesting actually to write an article on the history of the monastery. And now it's a Yomin monastery. This is some pictures I took a long time ago. I haven't been recently there. And as you can see on the inscription, it kind of proudly proclaims itself to be the sanctuary of Mazu. The name of the monastery changed a number of times over the history, and Yomin is the current, the latest iteration of the name of the monastery. So there is a story recorded in several early texts about the final passing away of Mazu. So I'm going to read it for you and then comment on it. As Mazu was about to pass away on the following morning, so this is just the day before he's about to die, late in the day, the head monk asked him, "You, Reverend Sir, seem unwell. How are you feeling?" And then Mazu says, "Sun-faced Buddha, moon-faced Buddha." Sounds mysterious, doesn't it? So, I mean, there are various interpretations you can impute to this particular saying. Of course, we have no way to know exactly if this dialogue actually transpired. But basically, these are names of two Buddhas that appear in some scripture. And one of them have very long lifespan, one of them have very short lifespan. So long, short, life, dead. Maybe indicates that kind of impermanence and relativity of time, temporal time frames. Anyway, he passes away, and then his legacy lives on with his disciples. And one of the way to really ascertain the importance or perceived importance of Chan teacher or master within the context of the larger historical development of Chan is to look to their disciples. It is the disciples who create and transmit and diffuse the legacy of the master. If a master is important during this period, maybe in some way, but really doesn't have disciples who continue that legacy, or in Chan terms, who continue his lineage, then probably historical record will to reflect that he will be pushed to a marginal position. So during his life, Mazu trains many disciples. He is actually the monk with the largest number of disciples that we have from the Tang or even the Sung also. I mean, like disciples whose names we have. So, for example, if you look at texts like Jingde Chuandeng Lu, 10% of this text, which is the whole history of Chan, well, from the Buddha or even before the 7 mythical Buddhas of the past, all the way to early Sung dynasty. So 10% are just direct disciples, the 3 Chuan out of 30 Chuan. Actually, it's even more than 10% because the last 3 Chuan are not hagiographers of monks. So he trains many of those disciples, and some of them become very influential and kind of featured in later sources about Chan teaching, doctrines, institutions, and so on. So these are some of the names. Baichang, I'm going to talk about him in more detail next week. I hope you will be able to join that and find it helpful. Wei Guan is kind of probably most of you have never heard of, but at that time he's very influential. I've written also about him in a couple of places. And he's one of the first disciples of Mazu who goes to Chang'an or Xi'an today, the capital of the Tang dynasty, and he becomes influential there. And there's some records about his life and teaching. Nanchuan, perhaps after Baijiang, in terms of the later Chan tradition, is the best known one. He's featured in many Gong'an and so on. There are some very famous stories, and I'm going to talk about him in more detail also later on in the series. And probably the head of the community, actually, after Mazu dies, is Sitang, another important disciple. So, as I mentioned already, so you have monks from all over China come to Hongzhou or Jiangxi, Gonggongshan first, and then Hongzhou, and they become disciples of Mazu. And then after he's passing away, or sometimes even before he passes away, they go to different parts of China, establish their monasteries. So really, this is the time when we have empire-wide or nationwide in contemporary parlance tradition of Mazu's disciples really being all over the two capitals, Chang'an, Luoyang, other parts of China. So they are monasteries run by disciples of Mazu. And in that sense, you can kind of trace this broad geographical spread, although it's true that also kind of there's more concentration in the south, of course, where Mazu kind of was active, and many of his disciples also kind of settled in that area. Mazu's disciples are also important in terms of the transmission of Chan into Korea. This is the first time the Chan teachings and practices are transmitted into Korea. Basically, the story in both Korea, later on in Japan, is that you have Korean monks coming to China to study Buddhism, and some of them end up in southern China, especially. And they study with Mazu's disciples. Mazu's already passed away, but with his prominent disciples, and then they go back to Korea and establish their own monasteries. And this is the beginning, the historical development of Chan or Son Buddhism in Korea. So in that sense, the Hongju school is very important in the spread of Chan into the Korean peninsula. And by and large, I mean, it's fair to say that Mazu is one of the best known or the most influential Chan masters of all time. And he's still prominently featured, and some of his ideas are also featured, not just in historical records and kind of reflection on the history, but also in modern version of Chan or Zen Buddhism. Maybe I can talk about it later on towards the end. So kind of this is a little bit about the historical background, and now I would like to move to talking a little bit about his teachings. So basically, I identified 6 themes, and I'm going to briefly talk about each one of them. And I will be using a primary source, that is to say, a passage from one of Mazu's sermons, and maybe one dialogue also to explain what he means. Now, again, in terms of, I don't want to bother you with all this nuance of provenance of text and so on. We're going to talk about Chan literature, so let's assume these are the actual teachings of Mazu for time being. So where is reality to be found, or how is reality to be defined? Well, Mazu basically embraces this Mahayana notion, which is certainly very prominent in mainstream Chinese Buddhism by this time, that there is one realm of reality, and that this reality pervades everything. We might not have direct access because of our ignorance, but reality is there. Reality is indivisible. So there is one passage, I'm going to read this. You have both the Chinese and my own translation. Whether there is establishing anything, or whether there is wiping out, all of it is sublime function. The sublime function is all oneself. It's not true that there is a place to stand where one departs from reality. The actual place one stands upon is identical to reality. So reality, nirvana, liberation, non-duality is not something to be found by abandoning the reality of everyday life, because there is no other place to go. Reality is here, there, everywhere, within, without. So where reality is fully manifested in each and every moment. It's not something special. It's not something that necessarily implies passing away and going into the deathless realm of nirvana. Or to put it another way, nirvana and samsara are interfused and inseparable. All of it is one essential being, and in that sense, from our perspective, though what I means, that's kind of also kind of complex issue, but reality is also to be found, it's our essential being. So it's futile to talk about that not being the same. Like if one is somewhere to assert that that not being the case, then what kind of person is that? All things instantiate the Buddhist truth, or ijie fa jie shi fo fa. So basically, I mean, fa can be translated in variety of ways, but here, like translated as things or phenomena, that each and every thing, the brick I showed you, the rosary, the water, myself, the books, the clouds, the trees, the bamboo I have outside, the flowers outside my window, they all instantiate the Buddhist tree. They all point to this one realm of reality that infuses and interpenetrates and permeates everything. Okay, and then it continues. So all things are identical with liberation. As to liberation, it's identical with suchness. So here we have some technical Buddhist terms: liberation, suchness, right? All things never depart from suchness. So there is beauty, there is ugliness, there is truth, there is falsehood, but everything as it is in its true nature is still can revert to exemplify, or ultimately is suchness, as it isness. Reality is basically things as they are. Whatever man be doing, whether walking, standing, sitting, or lying down, all of it is in conceivable function without having to wait for a suitable occasion to arise. So whatever we are doing, in a sense, is infused or manifest reality. And the scripture states that whatever place there might be, there is a Buddha there. So the Buddha is not a person you have to meet when you die and go to the Pure Land. The Buddha here is not even a person. Buddha here is basically, when you say Tsuwei or Fo, basically means the Buddha is everywhere, the reality is everywhere, right? So there is no place you can move on, no place you can go to where you live a reality. In that sense, the presence of a Buddha, Buddha as embodiment of reality is always there. Well, this sounds very, very positive, very good, right? Reality as it isness, suchness of things is always present. It infuses our very existence. It permeates all experiences, all events. It's manifest in all phenomena. So everything is wonderful. Everything is whole. Everything is perfect as it is. Now, of course, if we reflect on our own experience of reality, we know that's not the case. We have, right now, we have vicious war, we have all kinds of evil ideologies, all kinds of stupidity and discord human beings permeate. So how to reconcile? And also we have our own stupidity. I mean, maybe some of us are not as stupid as most humanity, but still, I mean, if you look down, deep down to ourselves with some level of self-awareness and criticism, obviously, we don't always manifest perfect Buddhahood, perfect wisdom, perfect compassion, and so on in our life. So, what's the reason for this dissonance between this kind of vision of reality that infuses everything in the actual experience of human beings being thrust into the world and trying to make sense, driven by their own propensities, desires, habits, and so on? So, which brings us to the problem of ignorance, right? This is a major theme in Buddhism as a whole, and how ignorance and awakening are related to each other. So, this is another passage from the records of Mazu that speaks about this. So, let me read and comment. It is in contrast to ignorance that one speaks to awakening. So awakening only exists, we talk about awakening, Buddha, the awakened one, in contrast to ignorance, living beings and Buddha, right? But really awakening is not something that is separate or distinct or it's not a thing that you can identify, pinpoint. Maybe it's not even experience as we understand experience itself. So we speak about awakening because of ignorance. If there is no ignorance, there is no awakening itself. It's just reality, it's just suchness, it's just dharma dhatu. Since originally there is no ignorance, awakening also need not be established. So here, originally there is no ignorance, kind of this kind of primordial perfection or Buddha nature that thinks in and of themselves. If you don't give rise to ignorance, things are just fine as they are. Suchness, as it is manifestation of truth. Okay, all living beings, since limitless eons ago, have been abiding in the samadhi of the Dharma nature. Well, they are in the samadhi of the Dharma nature, they wear their clothes, eat their food, talk, and respond to things. So to be in the samadhi of the Dharma nature, this perfect state of mind, you don't have to do anything special. You can manifest that, you can experience that as you wear your clothes, eat your food, talk with people, respond to things. That is within the context of everyday life. And I'm going to come to this theme later in the talk, the notion of ordinary mind, which is a major aspect of Mazu's teaching. But here, let me continue. As we make use of the six senses, all their activity is the Buddha nature. So in Buddhism, you have this kind of focus on jhanic meditations, where it's kind of withdrawal of the senses and development of pure mind, that attachment for everyday reality and so on. He flips that around and says really that there is no need to shut the mind from external reality, that really, because ultimately external reality is manifest within, without, and everywhere else. So basically, if one solves the problem of ignorance, transcends duality, lets go of attachments, misguided views, and so on, that really reality manifests through each and every act. There is no other place to go. There is no other realm to enter. So there is no this distinction between mundane and sacred realm. There is no need to transcend everyday life or samsara to achieve nirvana. It's a matter of perception. At least that's his perspective. But you find similar ideas in more sophisticated doctrinal reflections, traditions in Chinese Buddhism as well. So, okay, so this is wonderful. So I don't know if you knew that your life unfolds within this samadhi of the Dharma nature, that is to say, within this larger realm of reality. But, and there's always but, because of not knowing how to return to the source, they follow names and six forms. That gives rise to confused emotions and falsehood, creating all kinds of karmas. So while things might be perfect in and of themselves, if we can open up to the reality, the truth or the reality of our life is that really we don't return to the source. Basically means don't return. You can read here, interpret it in terms of Buddha nature, or in terms of, I don't know if you want both Madhyamika perspective, you can also interpret it in terms of return to realization of emptiness, of self and phenomena and so on. But anyway, there is kind of misapprehension of reality or truth, and creation of all kinds of distinctions and attachments, dualities, and so on. And from there, you have confused emotions, love, greed, hate, anger, jealousy, and so on. And then there's creation of karma, and then there's creation of samsara, or the experience of ignorant beings in the world. But, so here goes from but down to but up. But if one were within a single instant to illuminate within, then the whole essence is the holy mind. So, but yes, we create suffering, we create confusion, we create stupidity, we create samsara with all its suffering and imperfection. But the solution to ignorance is also present within each and every moment, because again, reality is always there, is something to be awakened. And the idea here being that if one can awaken deeply to reality, that there is, you can say, cognitive restructuring. And part of this cognitive restructuring is elimination of the sense of self, in which one opens up and then manifests reality. And then supposedly there's the promise of Buddhism more generally and Chan, that there is another way of being in the world without boundaries, without hindrances, without attachments, and so on. So then in another passage, Mazu talks about the realization of reality. How do we come to, there is the promise, reality is everywhere. There is just one realm of reality. And it's there to be uncovered, experienced, realized by us. But how do you go about it? So I'm reading here the translation. When a person comes to apprehend the true nature of the mind and external objects, so we have the mind and the world around us that is perceived by the mind, then there is no more arising of deluded thinking. So the idea is that all these bifurcated dualistic thoughts, emotions, foolish fixations, fantasies, and so on disappear when one apprehends the reality, and which is both within but also without. When deluded thinking is not created anymore, that's precisely the acceptance of reality based on the cognition of the uncreated nature of things. This is a little bit longer translation of a technical Buddhist term. It originally exists, and it exists in the present mind, not being something that is dependent on spiritual cultivation or sitting meditation. So reality is just things as they are. Whether you cultivate spiritually or not is still just one reality. Whether you're Buddha or the most foolish, ignorant, buffoonic, moronic human being, it's still the same reality. Maybe the one perceives, the other one does not, and there are consequences for realizing or not realizing reality. But ultimately, reality does not depend on our agency, on our actions, on our feelings, whether we understand it or not is there. And in that sense, going back to the story of the brick, it's kind of, you cannot create reality by spiritual cultivation or particular techniques might help. They may also hinder, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more next week, perhaps. It depends how you do it, right? But reality is not dependent on what we do and how we do it. Reality is just things as they are. Even if before there was a Buddha in the world, reality. So the Buddha is not somebody who creates reality. Buddha is somebody who awakens to reality and then communicates the insight he arrived at about the nature of reality, and supposedly, according to Buddhist tradition, tries to guide others, right? So Buddha is the guide. He points, guides, inspires, but does not create. The Dharma is just a way of pointing to the reality which is beyond words, beyond concepts, beyond ordinary conceptual frames of understanding ourselves and the world around us. Something that can be experienced, but the experience actually implies letting go of a notion of self, letting go of preconceived notions, letting go of dualistic patterns of thinking, and so on. And then, when there is no more attachment to practice and sitting, that's precisely the untamed meditation of the Tathagata. So I'm a meditator, I'm sitting, I'm practicing, and so on. As long as there is this self-awareness, this fixation to oneself, to one's practice, to one's techniques, to one's teacher, and so on, that's actually taints the true nature of reality, because the true nature of reality is to be experienced by abandoning all these patterns of thought, all these fixations on things. So this kind of continues a little bit more. At this moment, if you grasp this principle as it truly is, and you stop creating all kinds of unwholesome karmas, then you can pass your life at ease in accord with your circumstances. So that's all there is. It's awakening to truth. That's what the Buddha did under the Bodhi tree in India, according to tradition, right? He didn't do anything special. There was no act of divine grace bestowed on him by some deity or anything like that. He woke up to the principle, kind of term in Chinese, both in Chinese philosophy and Chinese Buddhism, with some important connotations, but basically the true nature of reality. So if you do that and then you disengage yourself or let go of foolish, deluded ways of acting and thinking in the world, then our problems are solved. I mean, maybe not the problems in terms of, I mean, there are some external aspect. I mean, if somebody comes to kill you, if there is a war or something. Here, they're talking about very verified understanding of the world and reality, kind of shifting perspective or cognitive restructuring or something like that, which kind of operates in certain contexts. It does not solve the issues of everyday life for most people in terms of war, economic dislocation, poverty, fear, and so on. But this is kind of spiritual, kind of high-end, very idealistic way of looking about the reality of human life and the potential for self-transcendence and freedom. And again, always in equitable circumstances. So here, again, liberation never implies departure from this world. Liberation is to be found. It's just not so much changing the world around it, but changing the perspective of how we engage and how we understand and how we interpret and how we think. An important part of this shift in perspective is, of course, change in terms of our perception of ourselves. That is to say, going back to the notion of self and no self. And then he evokes these monastic ideals, kind of, I'm continuing here. As a monk, all you need is a single robe and a single alms bowl. So he's evoking this kind of very austere way of religious life as a shramana, as a bhikkhu. Whether sitting or getting up, you're always independently implicated with it. This passage is not clear, but basically whatever we are doing, each activity is kind of, you're engaged with reality, if you choose so, or if you're able to do so. You should strictly observe the monastic precepts, and you should endeavor to accumulate wholesome karma. I'm going to come back to this kind of notion of importance of monastic life and ideals later on. And this is important to understand that he's kind of, when he says reality is everywhere, all you have to do is just let go of attachments and realize the one through Dharma Tattva and then behave spontaneously and so on. This can be misapprehended or misapplied to mean, you know, just everything goes kind of hedonistic, self-centered lifestyle. So there are caveats within the text that say that's not the case, really. These teachings is to be understood within monastic life or within religious life, where there's discipline and morality and ethics and so on. Okay, and then the final passage here is, if you are able to act like that, then how can there be any concern about not being able to understand the truth? So just follow these instructions without, of course, attaching to the instructions themselves, but basically let go of self, of other, of creating boundaries of ignorance, of the attachment, and just let it be, let reality manifest within, without, infuses everything. And then I suppose he says, then everything is going to be wonderful, everything will be groovy, you're liberated, even though at that point of liberation, you're not really thinking in terms of self. So let me, okay, so this is the realization of a reality. Last time when I was giving the talk, and actually I do lecture quite a bit, I'm sorry, this is 2 hours. I cannot last talking. My voice disappears. Last time I was talking, I almost lost my voice and so on. So if you don't mind, let's have a 2-minute break, and then I'm going to get some more water, and kind of you can stretch yourself so we don't have to sit for 2 hours and me talking. And also in terms of the structure, we are going to have some discussion, and I think the way the center structured this is to have a chat, to use the chat function. So if you have questions, please bring them into the chat, kind of write them down, and then it will be mediated. Last time, I apologize, it didn't work perfectly because there were too many of them and I kind of couldn't read them all and figure out, but I think we will have the moderator will kind of select some of the questions or maybe kind of combine them and then ask me. So we'll have some time for question and answer towards the end. So again, so 2 minutes break. Thank you. Okay, I hope we can continue now. In terms of the general perception of Mazu and his teachings, there are two particular adages or statements or sayings that are associated with him. The first one is mind is Buddha, which is indicated by the term, it kind of points to the intimate relationship between the mind and Buddhahood. And the second one is ordinary mind as the way, or ordinary mind is the way is the exact saying. So let me kind of briefly talk about these two. So mind and Buddha. there are different Chinese way, Jixin, Jixin Shifu or Xinji Shifu, whatever, but basically mine is Buddha, is the literal English translation. So there is a passage in the record of Mazu that kind of talks about this. So it goes something like this. Each of you should right away believe that your own mind is Buddha, that this very mind is identical with the Buddha mind. For that reason, the great master Bodhidharma came from South India to China, transmitting the one mind teaching of the Supreme Vehicle in order to cause you to experience awakening. So there's quite a bit of here. So it's about this kind of notion that the Buddha is to be found within the mind, which kind of you can say is related to the Buddha nature theory. And in that sense, that the mind of the Buddha and the mind and your mind or the mind of ordinary person are not necessarily different. And really, the Bodhidharma, so this kind of evoking this legend of Bodhidharma and the notion of transmission of Chan from India to China is about revealing this truth, that this one mind teaching of the Supreme Vehicle, one mind, you find that in classical texts, in Awakening of Faith, for example, is important text, important concept, sorry. A Supreme Vehicle, again, there are a number of approaches of vehicles to Buddhism, and this is kind of the highest, the most supreme teaching. So basically here, the one mind teaching of the Supreme Vehicle is that this is the highest teaching of Buddhism, which is about the nature of mind and reality, right? And then goes on to say, he often quoted the Lankavatara scripture in order to imprint the minds of living beings, fearing that they are perturbed and lack faith in themselves. The truth of this one mind is something that each one of you possesses. Therefore, it is stated in the Lankavatara scripture that according to the Buddha's teaching, the mind is the essential principle, and that the lack of a particular point of entry is the essence of the teaching. The last passage is kind of a little bit freer, the last clause that is a little bit freer translation, woman by famen, literally no gate is Dharma gate sometimes, but it's really bad kind of Chin English kind of translation. But basically, okay, within this second part of this this passage, he's talking basically, he's evoking scriptural authority, namely the Lankavatara scripture. And Lankavatara scripture is evoked quite a bit in early Chan texts, both within the Hungsha school, but also even more so within the Northern school and so on. The basic idea here is that really Chan relies on the scriptural authority, and that the teachings of the scripture resonates with the teachings of Chan, right? So why is this notion of Buddha nature, of the presence of the Buddha mind in some way within each person important? Is because we lack faith in ourselves. We feel hopeless, we feel confused, we try to seek salvation by believing in external deity, God, or by wanting to be reborn in some kind of paradise, whether it's Christian notion of paradise or the Amitabha Pure Land, and so on and so forth. But really, there's nobody who can do this for us, at least from this particular perspective, that really one have to fight. The problem of human existence is within the mind, it is within ourselves, within our capacity for ignorance, for delusion, for discrimination, for engendering negative emotions, and so on. But also the solution of dukkha, of samsaric existence, is to be found within the mind, is through this realization of reality, is this transcendence, through detachment, through increasingly sublime and nuanced ways of engaging with the world in a more truthful, more genuine, a more wise way of being. So So that's why kind of the mind is the focal point of the Buddhist path, both in terms of practice and realization. The source of dukkha, the creation of samsaric existence, the problems of human uh, life, and so on can be traced to our own mind, to our own engenderment of all kinds of misapprehensions and attachments and foolish fixation. But also the solution is to be found with the mind. Spiritual cultivation focuses on the mind. It's supposedly the answer to this problem of suffering and imperfection in human existence is to be found within the mind. And there is no particular point. There is no particular guru that can lead you. There is no particular sect. There is no particular technique, and so on. So this is why I translate woman away from man. That really there is no particular point of entry into truth, because truth is not a place. Truth is not something that can be defined in a narrow dogmatic way. It's not so much going somewhere, experiencing something, but letting go of attachments, letting go of foolish fixation, letting go of dualistic patterns of thought, letting go of habitual patterns of thinking, and so on, letting go of the notion of self, dying to oneself in some way, and then simply when one lets go of everything, then letting reality manifest itself and infusing everything within, and without necessarily implying that there is distinction between within and without. Okay, so this is very inspiring. A long time ago, before my academic life, I was a Buddhist monk, and I was teaching, especially I was not too much making career as a preacher or being a guru or anything like that, but I ended up doing some teaching. And I remember when I would talk with people, and I mentioned like Buddha nature, people, have all kinds of problems in life, and, lack of confidence, or maybe sometimes even self-hate and so on. So when you say, well, actually, don't worry, behind all of this, deep down, in reality, you're a Buddha. You have the Buddha nature within you. So this is as positive spin you can get on understanding both human existence, and also the developing certain spiritual religious outlook on the human potential, as positive as it gets, right? I mean, we're all Buddhas deep within, whatever that within and Buddha might mean, that's open to interpretation. So I remember people's eyes will light up. Oh, wonderful, I'm a Buddha. That's kind of, now over the years I've been thinking about it, and especially I first started, got involved in Buddhism in terms of more monastic and so on in Asia, and when I came back to this country. So yeah, there was this kind of notion of Buddha nature and kind of the spiritual development and meditation and so on. But then I started to think, I mean, in our culture, I mean, we have a little bit emphasis on individualism and kind of certain conception of the self, which is based on certain therapeutic models which reify the notion of self as it tied up certain identity. So then it makes me think about, I mean, is this notion of, of Buddha nature really helpful? Basically, if you have a bunch of egomaniacs go there to become meditators so that they can kind of have some experience and become superior, or kind of become gurus or Zen masters, or just enlightened beings, is that really that helpful? So going back to Mazu, I mean, he's addressing these kind of issues, the idea that we are all on some basic level Buddhas might be inspiring, but can be also problematic if it becomes a form of attachment or self fixation, or if the spiritual path becomes not a way of developing capacity to let go of self and things and ideas and attachments and so on, and opening up to reality by the dissolution of this erroneous notion of self. But if it becomes part of this kind of way of enhancing the self, reifying the self in a more spiritualized way. So kind of within the record of Mazu, there is this one particular dialogue, and this is also, there's lots of commentary on these particular ideas in some of the writings or the records of Mazu's disciples. I don't have time, but I've written of this if you're interested. But let me go over this dialogue and can explain this a little bit. So this is supposedly a conversation between a Mazu and anonymous monk. So a monk asked Mazu, "Reverend, why do you say that mind is Buddhist?" This is his famous teaching that Mazu is promoting. So why do you have this particular teaching? And Mazu said, to stop the crying of small children. This comes actually from a scripture, kind of. But the basic idea, this notion, okay, we have problems, we are crying, we are dissatisfied, and he says, okay, you're Buddha, don't worry about it. But here, if you give something, candy or something to the kid to make it stop crying, that's a temporary solution, right? And it's not based on some deep reality. So it's basically its particular purpose. The kid is crying and you give something there, you give a candy. So the mind is, Buddha is teaching that is supposed to address certain real issue in spiritual life. This lack of confidence, lack of belief in oneself, to inspire people to look within and so on. But it's still just something that is temporal, that is provisional, and so on. Okay, so then the next part of the conversation. What are you going to say when they have stopped crying? So once they kind of stop with this kind of basic lack of confidence or confusion and so on, and the Master says, then I will change my teaching because the teachings are not fixed. I will say it's neither mine nor Buddha, because mine and Buddha are just conceptual construct. And again, going back to its one realm of reality, which is beyond all forms, shapes, concepts, dualities. It's ineffable, it's transcendental but immanent, or actually all these distinctions lose meaning within it. So ultimately, it's not mind, it's not Buddha, because these are just conceptual constructs. And if you attach to either one of them, then you create a problem. All right. Then, okay, so this continues. If there's someone who does not belong to either of these two categories of persons, so how do you going to instruct them, right? So kind of, okay, so basically you have this kind of a sense of progression, spiritual progression, right? I will tell them it's not a thing. And this goes back to this, I think I spoke a little bit about this kind of Buddha nature, essentialized and non-essentialized understandings, that Buddha nature, mind, reality, it's not a thing that can be grasped. Buddha nature is not something you can see, because the act of seeing implies subject and object duality. So there is no Buddha nature within you, something there like Atman-like essence that you can perceive. So it's not a thing. And this kind of moves into more of a Madhyamika kind of emptiness outlook, right? That really reality cannot be predicated in terms of particular concepts. It's not in terms of, doesn't have any ontological status that can be interpreted as some kind of essence. And then finally, when you have somebody who's above all these categories, what are you going to do about it? I would simply teach them to realize the great way. And what's the realization? Well, there's nothing to be said about it. This is like Vimalakirti's silence, right? In this famous discussion with exchange with Manjushri about the realm of non-duality, that ultimately there is nothing to be said about the nature of reality, but it's something that can be experienced. At least that's the promise of Buddhism in general, and certainly of Chan, and that this experience of reality, which is not particularly explained in a particular framework. I mean, you can point to it, you can maybe try to even explain it in some way, but ultimately you have to let go of all of that and realize the great way, the Dao, the Dao. And then that's the goal of practice, right? So here you can see this kind of sense of progression, spiritual progression. So you have particular teaching, which is supposed to perform certain functions to inspire maybe people to address certain misconceptions or certain problems or certain fixations. But then the teaching, if you become attached to particular teaching or particular perspective, then that becomes obstacle because you have attachment, and attachment is the problem. And then you have to transcend that by going to another level of increasing the attachment and transcendence. So mind in Buddha becomes not the mind of Buddha, and then it's not a thing. And finally, even thinking a thing or no thing disappears, and there's simple realization, or at least that's the promise of Chao, as articulated by Mazu. This brings us to the notion of skillful means, or Fangbian, or Upaya. So there is nothing fixed about any Buddhist teachings, that really there is no particular dogma that can capture the true nature of reality. That all teachings are basically strategies for guiding actual human beings in terms of their capacities, in terms of their circumstances they find themselves, in terms of their psychological, spiritual predilections, and so on. So the teachings are not fixed, and they have to be deployed strategically, and ultimately each teaching have to be dissolved, because ultimately, as the simile of the raft used to cross the river of samsara and to reach the other shore of nirvana, famous simile you find in the Pali Canon and other canonical sources, indicates is that ultimately Buddhism, the Buddha's Dharma dissolve itself. Dharma is teaching, Dharma is particular doctrinal propositions or spiritual practices have to be let go to realize Dharma is ultimate truth, which is beyond the words, concepts, conceptual constructs, and so on. So this, you find this kind of idea, of course, is not unique to Mazu. You find it in a number of scriptures. He's just employing it in a particular way, a particular context, and I think he does that very skillfully, especially in the context of this particular dialogue that I mentioned. So within, for example, in the Lotus scripture, you have the notion of three vehicles, that they are all basically upaya, they're all expedient means, they are not really something that is true, they are provisional in nature. There is one vehicle only, but what's the one vehicle? Actually, the Lotus Sutra does not really tell you what the one vehicle is really, it just tells you there is one vehicle that transcends all conceptual fixations, all approaches, all techniques, and so on. So kind of, and there's lots of things to unpack here about the doctrine of skillful means. Maybe that's a topic for another time, but it's basically a critique of much of religion, really, religious dogmaticism, like this is the truth, or the truth is to be found within particular tradition or a particular scripture, or particular church. And this is what usually we think of when we think about religion, right? This kind of dogmatic, narrow attachment, this kind of exclusivist truth claim, this kind of absolutisms, like this is the truth and nothing but the truth, and you have to follow and accept and so on, even if sometimes it's kind of expressed in very, very simplistic, even foolish ways. So this is kind of a critique of attachment as particular truth claims. If you have Buddha, you destroy the Buddha. I mean, if you need Buddha, you kind of construct the Buddha, but if you, at some point, as Lynch said, sometimes you have to kill the Buddha if there's too much attachment to the Buddha, because the Buddha of your mind is not the real Buddha, it's just our image, our mental construct, our object of attachment that we create, and so on. So all religious teachings and all the texts and all the traditions and all the spiritual practices that are associated with them are provisional. They're not ultimate. They are like fingers pointing to the moon. They are practical guidance, which if you follow, understand on a deeper level may be helpful, but if you're attached to, can be unhelpful. And so even if they point to the ultimate truth, and sometimes religious teaching also point away from ultimate truth. I mean, much of religion, as understood, as practiced by many people in the world, is about creating distinctions, creating attachments between self and other sectarian notions, starting wars about that, and so on. So putting that, all that kind of stuff around, but even the highest, the most beautiful, the most profound, the deepest teachings are just provisional constructs that are simply meant to guide individuals towards higher understanding, towards reality, towards this one realm of reality, which ultimately is indescribable. And it cannot be captured by dogma, by text, by teaching, but it certainly is not in a possession of a particular group or sect or church or anything like that. So, okay, and then let me just briefly talk about ordinary mind. So there is this famous passage, and as you notice, I use this as the title with some alteration as title of one of my books. The way needs no special method of spiritual cultivation. All you need to do is put an end to engendering all sorts of defilements. What are defilements? If you have a mind mired in the cycle of birth and death, engage in deliberate acts, and having self-centered ambitions, then everything you do is defilement. If you want to directly know the way, then ordinary mind is the way. So the way, the Tao, spiritual life, does not have to assume particular form or shape or be associated with a particular technique or outlook. All you need to do is stop defilements here in a sense of propensity, attitudes, emotions that lead to distorted perception of self and reality. So here gives you examples. If the mind, basically, if you have mind that is stuck within samsara, that is to say the mind of an ordinary human being that is engaged with all kinds of fanciful things, fantasies, misapprehensions, and so on. If we act in a self-centered way, that implies also a wrong understanding of self, basically egoistic impulses and so on, then everything you do, including all spiritual practices, is defilement. And if you want to know the mind, the way directly, the Tao directly, then ordinary mind is the way. So ordinary mind is the approach to truth. And then it goes on to explain. Ordinary mind denotes a state of mind in which there are no deliberate actions, no ideas about right and wrong, no grasping and discarding, no notions of annihilation and permanence, no ordinary or sacred. So basically here you have this kind of transcendence of all dualities. The scripture says, unlike the practice of ordinary people, and like the practice of sages, that's the practice of bodhisattvas. So we have this kind of hedonistic, foolish lifestyle of most of humanity. And then you have this kind of understanding of spirituality as something that is sacred, that is very different, that is disjoined from ordinary life. So the practice of bodhisattva is neither one of those extremes. I guess this is, you can say, a Chan way, or not just Chan, this is a scriptural quotation from Mahayana scripture of middle way. At this very moment, as you engage in walking, standing, sitting, and reclining, and as you respond to various situations and deal with other people, everything you do and encounter is the way. So again, practice is not to be found outside of everyday life, that each and every opportunity, each and every sight, each and every thought, each and every sound, even disturbing sounds like some junk call that is just arriving on my phone in the other room, everything is opportunity to put ordinary mind into practice, to engage in a wise, enlightened way. So, or to put it another way, spiritual practice is not something that implies fixating on a particular technique or doing a particular observance or removing yourself from the world and not engaging. That you can do whatever, well, not whatever you do, it doesn't imply like getting drunk or doing some criminal activity, but basically it's engaged in everyday activity, and it's also engaging with situations, with things, with events, and so on. Dealing with people, everything can be part of spiritual practice. So looking at ordinary mind, I mean, they're basically, in terms of the modalities of ordinary mind, you can think in two ways. One is as an idealized state of mind. So ordinary way of mind is really a state of mind that is to be achieved through spiritual cultivation. You can say it's manifestation of a Buddha nature, but non-essentialized interpretation of Buddha nature. Or, for example, you have other terms like non-abiding mind. You find, especially this is important term in a treatise, famous treatise written by Daju, one of Mazu's disciple. He elaborates this: mind that does not abide on anything, does not fixate on any of the categories or any of the notions of self, of other, of holiness, of non-holiness, or ordinariness, of enlightenment and ignorance, and so on. But ordinary mind is also a form of spiritual practice. Basically, it's the state of mind that one is supposed to cultivate. And it involves constant reflection, constant refinement of detachment, of transcendence. It can be practiced in and of itself, but for most people, that's very difficult to do. Most people need some kind of technique, some kind of structure, some kind of guidance. So it can be integrated with other practices. So you can do meditation or you can do ritual, something like that, but kind of understand it and enact it within the frame of this notion of ordinary mind. But it can also be admittedly very rare, very, very difficult to enact practice of its own. Now, so kind of to put this into context, so part of the reason Mazu is focusing on ordinary mind is to counteract this tendency to understand Buddhism in very supernatural or very transmundane world. And so, for example, if you look at the Bodhisattva path that is described in the scriptures, it provides certain structure, but ultimately, if you look at the stages, for example, if you look Huayanqing, often rendered in English as flower adornment scripture, the notion of generosity and morality, and certainly meditation of the Bodhisattva, not to mention wisdom. I mean, it's so deep, it's so profound, it's just completely disengaged. It's completely operates at a different register than what we are able to achieve. So Bodhisattvas, kind of, it's a path of practice, but it's also so rarefied, so profound, so deep, so removed from everyday reality. So if you look at the stages of the Bodhisattva path also, I mean, you start with, this is the Huayan taxonomy of 10 faiths, 10 abode, 10 practices, 10 dedication, 10 stages, equal enlightenment, sublime enlightenment. If you go to Gante Vyuha, or the last chapter of the Huayanqing, where you have the journey of Sudana, the young pilgrim, I mean, there's lots of wonderful instruction and this kind of lots of deep symbolism and maybe beautiful narration and so on. But it's also so out there. I mean, so deep, so transcendental. So seems to be beyond our ken, our capacity for understanding and engagement. And then if you look at beyond the path, the Mahayana path is a path of practice and spiritual cultivation. Then you have this kind of whole notion of otherworldly realms, of pantheon populated with various Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, celestial beings. I mean, again, going back to Huayanqing, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of names of different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and they appear in all kinds of spiritual realms that are very different than the world in which we live. And they are this kind of, and it's not just one realm, but innumerable world. Again, this is all very symbolic. I mean, yeah, I guess you can interpret it literally, but perhaps that's not how it was meant. It's basically to point to moving away from our ordinary understanding of reality and opening the mind to different ways of perceiving a reality. So this is kind of overwhelming the mind with these images of other worldly realm. But if this is understood, it's still very remote, very different, almost unattainable as far as our own limited human ability and experience is concerned. And then you have this depiction of miracles that bodhisattvas and Buddhas do. They emit rays of light that illuminate the world. Then you have this notion of interpenetration, which the whole world manifests in the tip of a hair of a Buddha and Huayan Jing and all kinds of rich symbolism. There is much to be unpacked there, but basically there's this kind of notion of spiritual life that is very resplendent, infused with otherworldly elements, with miracles, with Buddhas, with bodhisattvas, celestial realms, and so on, which is kind of quite removed from the reality of our own life, which is sitting in a chair talking. For most of you, probably going to work and dealing with all kinds of idiots, your boss or co-workers, or getting stuck in traffic and so on. So one way to think about ordinary mind is also to say, well, really, Buddhism is not about this kind of otherworldly realms, about hoping to be reborn in the pure land of Amitabha or kind of Akshobhya, or kind of experience some kind of lightening light or bodhisattva manifesting. You go to, I don't know, Buddhishan and Manjushri manifest to you, but it's really about the experience of the present moment, of reality as it manifests in each and every moment. So kind of a couple of other points. I don't know, it looks like, I don't know what was that. There were many more questions, I think. I don't know how many questions there are. Do we have many questions or not really?
Not really. At the moment, only one question. Yeah.
Okay, so then why don't I talk a little bit more and then I can try to address that. And if some other people have questions, please feel free to have them. So kind of, this is something I alluded to. This kind of, the potential for misapprehending this kind of teaching is kind of very abstract, very fine. I mean, okay, ordinary mind, but how do you cultivate it? It's not talking about particular techniques and so on. And also this kind of notion of ordinary mind or Buddha nature within can be understood to mean that, well, okay, if reality is manifest in everything, then I can pretty much do whatever I want to do. It's still manifestation of reality. You have these ideas in East Asian Buddhism, maybe carried to even more extremes. I mean, you have some of that in China, but even more extremes in Japanese Buddhism, in Hongaku Shiso, original enlightenment taught, and so on. So how do you deal with this potential for misapprehending the teachings, for moving into this kind of realm of China antinomianism? Basically, everything goes, because if everything is manifestation of the Buddha mind, if each and every experience is manifestation of suchness, if the Buddha is within, and if I'm a Buddha, and then all my acts are acts of a Buddha, then that can lead into some kind of dangerous ethical directions. So this is why it's important to keep in mind the institutional context, that really Mazu was living in a monastery. He was a monastic himself. He was engaged, he was instructing his own monks who were engaged in contemplative practices. And of course, there is invocation of monastic ideals. There was a brief one about early on in one of the passages that I mentioned, but basically also about these basic ideas here: rejecting contemplative practice, criticizing, or is he trying to explain how you should engage and use various contemplative practices? So to put it another way, if you look at the context in which this teaching were developed, that really the enactment of freedom and spontaneity, and spontaneity is a very important idea here, that are invoked by ordinary mind is not to be understood in terms of kind of, not doing anything, just leading your life and kind of having life like everybody else, but it's within the context of discipline, moral, ethical, spiritually infused life. So it's about how to lead that life without being attached, you know, to particular perspective or to particular dogma, to particular moral framework, and so on. So this is kind of, I think that kind of historical context is important as we try to make sense of these teachings and perhaps reflect of how they are relevant. So there are Mazu's ideas, especially about mind and Buddha and ordinary mind. You can find it in the records of his later disciples. I'm going to just mention a couple. The first one is this famous poem by Pang Yun, his late disciple. So basically elaborates on this notion of ordinary mind. So the first two lines are, my activity is not different, it's only that I'm spontaneously in harmony with it, right? So kind of, I don't do anything special. I don't have to put special robes, so go to some rock and sit there wearing some strange robes, or, you know, and then maybe make somebody take a picture of me and put it in an Instagram or something. So kind of, I'm not doing anything special really. I'm just kind of, I do it in a different way. I'm in harmony with what I'm doing. So I don't grasp, I don't reject. There's nothing to assert, nothing to oppose. And I'm going to skip a couple of lines, and then the most famous two lines that are joined. Supernatural powers and wonderful activity, fetching water and carrying fireworks. So this is kind of almost the opposite of this kind of supernatural vistas of celestial bodhisattvas manifesting lights and powers and coming up with very deep and profound pronouncement that really the real supernatural power and sublime activity of a genuine jhana that is to be found in ordinary acts such as fetching water and carrying firewood. Or in my case, yesterday I was rebuilding my footpath into the forest on the back of my property. I was carrying bricks, kind of doing the siding for the footpath. So it could be other things as well. And then the other one comes from Linchi, the famous Chan master. He's usually regarded as a third generation disciple of Mazu. So there's this passage from his record. From the point of view of this mountain monk, there are not that many things you need to be anxious about. Only be ordinary, wearing your clothes and eating your food, passing your time without any concerns. All of you, coming from various directions, you have mind set on something. You seek the Buddha, seek the Dharma, and seek liberation and transcendence of the three realms. Fools, if you want to leave the three realms, where are you going to go? These are the three realms of existence in Buddhist cosmology, right? So basically, again, he's talking about specific audience. So they are the foolish, kind of ordinary people, you know, that for him, the ultimate expression of meaning is, you know, Budweiser and watching football on the TV and just eating some junk food with their buddies. So kind of that kind of superficial hedonistic lifestyle is, of course, kind of out of question from this perspective. But so here he's talking about Buddhist practitioner who goes to another extreme, who basically seek particular experience, are fixated on certain goals, reify the path, attached to particular technique, have some kind of misguided notions about spiritual life and transcendence, realization and experience. And this is even a critique of kind of dualistic understanding of nirvana, right? Sorry, there is nowhere to go. So we are stuck, it's here. We just have to make peace and find meaning within the world we live. There's no other place to go. It's just one realm of reality. It is what it is as it unfolds within the moment, each and every moment of our life. And that's what we make out of it. So again, this is basically counteracting certain, both rejecting ordinary hedonistic lifestyles, but also certain somewhat misguided forms of spirituality or religiosity, and pointing out that really yes, reality, we might be disengaged from ourselves and the world. It creates boundaries and dualities and hindrances and delusions and so on. But the solution is not to go somewhere else to become something else. It is what it is. You just have to let go of all defilements and so on, and realize the immediacy of awakening. Again, understanding this provisional concept within each and every moment, within each and every phenomena, within each and every instance of reality manifesting itself, within, without, neither of those. So those are some of the ideas about kind of elaboration of Mazu's ideas. There's of course much more to be said, but I think I'm going to stop at this point. We have a little bit of time, so if I can, are there any questions I should address?
Yes, there are 3 questions so far. The first question is Mazu's the mind, the Buddha, the entry via principle or practice? The question was asked 9:33 by Sanji. So can I share this?
Maybe I will.
Yeah, so it is, the question is Mazu's the mind and the Buddha, they are coming in within quote, the entry via principle or practice?
Mind and Buddha is principle of practice. Let me open
so
just.
It's 9:33. The question is was asked.
Let me move.
I am not sure what the question is asking.
To 9:33 is Mazu the mind, the Buddha, drained of a principle of practice. Okay. This goes back to this distinction in Bodhidharma's record, or kind of what's attributed to Bodhidharma about principle, the entry via principle and entry via practice. Could be both, I suppose. It depends how you approach it. I mean, if you again, it can be as a principle of reality, basically understand that the Buddha, you know, the Buddha is within, but again, it's not particular thing and so on. So there's certain way of understanding what Buddhahood means in this context. Then if you can realize that, then yes, there's that kind of leap into the realm of reality and transcendence and enlightenment and so on. So it could be that, but also reflection on mind and Buddha and the reality of it can also be a form of practice. So it can be both. It depends how you apply it. Okay, so then okay, I can read
Next
here.
question also, yeah.
10:11.
Yeah, 10:11. Yeah.
Did Mazu teach the procedure of formal sitting meditation really necessary? So basically it's about, is formal meditation really something that is important part of the teaching? And then it's formless meditation is an advanced technique that it's not really a norm before the popularity. Okay, I'm going to talk about meditation. Actually, I have a whole lecture on that. So kind of, I don't know when it comes, like a few weeks down the line. But basically, we don't know. I mean, I've written about this, that the status of formal meditation, and going back to the story about the brick, I mean, does it imply that, I mean, certainly it's possible to read that formal meditation, sochan, or sitting in meditation is not really a requirement. Certainly it's not requirement, but it's also not something you should be doing because it implies attachment. Or, you know, it's kind of, it's formal meditation. Did they really practice how monastic life was structured at Mazu's monastery and so on? We really don't know. What I can say with certainty is, even if they did practice meditation, probably they did practice some kind of contemplation methods. We don't know exactly what they were doing, but certainly focus on particular technique, like we find in later chant, starting with Daoyi and the Kanghua technique, and going in the Kanghua today that is practiced. That's really not part of the tradition. So it doesn't mean that they didn't do some kind of formal practices, but probably this was kind of integrated with this particular understanding of spirituality in terms of ordinary mind, in terms of detachment, in terms of transcendence. There is quite a bit of critique of formal meditation practice or formal practice of any type. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're criticizing actual practices, but maybe attachment to practices, or maybe this kind of fetishization of techniques, which you find quite a bit of in Buddhism. So, because it's true, and this is one aspect of Chan that makes it problematic, it's kind of elitist discourse. It's very abstract. It doesn't provide actual guidance. I mean, most people, in terms of their capacity for understanding, in terms of the problems they face in their spiritual life and so on, they start at a very, very basic level. I mean, sometimes people start at a basic level, they're deluded, they're wise and enlightenment and so on. But basically, most people operate at a very, very basic, low level of spiritual development, or even keeping the 5 precepts is very difficult. Reflection of attachments and of notions of self and so on, it's difficult, and everything becomes, even the contemplation of no self or impermanence becomes a form of attachment, enhancing the self and so on. So that's the problem. So how do you go about it is how do you find a balance? And I think I'm going to talk about it later, or maybe you have this kind of balance a little bit better actually in Tiantai meditation models, where Jay is talking about both formless practice, which is this kind of very high, rarefied way of contemplating the true nature of reality without reliance on any forms or practices or techniques or anything like that. But that's very difficult to do for most people. And you have to provide some kind of form of guidance for most ordinary people who need some kind of ritual, who need some kind of moral structure, who need some kind of techniques and so on. So we don't have enough information about what exactly was happening at Mazu's monastery, but from the context and looking, the historical context and various biographies and so on, it seems to be it was in many ways assumed many of the features of mainstream monastic congregation, in which we can assume there was some kind of form of practice, but again, not fetishized. Like if you compare with Daoyi, for example, where all you do is just kankwa, you just meditate, sit there and just keep the kwato. Definitely very different approach, almost different tradition, but it does not mean that there was no practice. But unfortunately, we don't have information about this, like what exactly in terms of practical instructions, like, I mean, beyond, keep ordinary mind and non-duality and so on. The records we have operate in a very high, very abstract, very, I mean, maybe for those people who like that kind of discourse, very beautiful, very holistic, maybe even inspiring way, but they don't provide much in terms of practical guidance, including techniques that one can use.
Yes, so there is a very simple question. The 1014 that the question is asked, I think, the term that you are interpreting as the way. What is the Chinese word for the way?
Dao. Yeah, it is Dao. Yes.
Yeah, then 1018, another question. It is about the Dharma I. Does the term of the Dharma I like used in
where is that?
1018.
And does the term of the Dharma I?
Think so.
Dharma I, what does it mean? Yeah, this is this kind of problematic assertions. It's also, you have this Jiangxing. How is in Japanese Jiangxing? So this kind of notion that is the I that perceives the Buddha nature, but I mean, you can imply, you can understand, obviously it's not like a third eye or anything like that, but this kind of capacity to see the truth. It can be problematic in terms of understanding certain kind of notion of subjectivity and then object of awareness being the true nature of reality, the Dharma, and so on. So there's lots of to unpack with that, but yeah, it could be understood as some kind of supernatural capacity, or it could be understood in symbolic terms as simply the capacity to know the truth. Not some kind of specific faculty or specific psychic ability or certain level of consciousness or ability to be aware, not some kind of supernatural eye we have. Though of course in certain religious tradition you have that kind of notion, right? Whether it's immanent, transcendental, I guess at the point of awakening, the notion between immanence and transcendence collapse. So it's kind of, but this is a problem, and this is like in a critique of Japanese Zen and or East Asian Buddhism as a whole, is that really moves away from, this is in critical Buddhism, Hihan Bukkyo, kind of, which was more in fashion 20 years ago in Japanese academic circles, that really much of East Asian Buddhism and misunderstands Buddhism by postulating certain very Atman-like, very reified notion of Buddha nature, in which, you know, there is the Buddha nature within. And this goes back to this passage of Mazu, where he says, mind is Buddha, but don't fixate on mind, don't fixate on Buddha, don't kind of create some kind of either ontology or epistemology in which you imply that there is a mind that perceives Buddhahood and so on. That is to say, don't reify, don't essentialize both the mind and the state of Buddhahood. So it depends. So the criticism here, and certainly it's a valid criticism for Dogen, is, or you can find in platform scripture, this notion of perceiving the nature is that implies that there is some kind of nature there, some kind of essence to be perceived, which from another Buddhist perspective is kind of a problematic assumption.
Okay, the last question, I think,
Chan
origin of Chan, antinomians.
What is the origin of Chan antinomians? So, I mean, it's possible. There are unintended consequences of all these teachings, right? I mean, my argument that I've written on this subject is that really the Hongzhou school, there's very little there in their records to indicate that they were moving into antinomian directions themselves. That is to say, this kind of rejection of conventional morality and acting out, basically following, behaving in unrestrained, unconventional ways, with the assumption that, you know, that whatever you do is manifestation of your Buddha essence and comes from different understanding of reality and so on. So I don't see much of that. You can find elements maybe, and sometimes this rhetorical stance, sometimes really certain statements taken out of context can be understood. You can find this also within the Baotang school in Sichuan, which is kind of really talks about rejection of practices, rituals, traditions, and so on. But if you look at what happens on the ground, for the most part, I would say Chan, with some exceptions, definitely, is a tradition that is very traditionalist. I mean, it's a monastic tradition. Again, the individuals at times and places, for example, during the early Ming Dynasty, my colleague Jiang Wu describes this kind of performative antinomianism, where Chan monks try to revive the tradition. This is late Ming, early Qing, I think, if I remember correctly. So they kind of engage with this kind of shouting and screaming and beating you find in some records from the Sung Dynasty attributed to earlier masters and so on. I'm also going to address this issue of Chan antinomianism when I talk about the story of Nanchuan killing the cat. So I will have more to say. But basically, I don't know how much there is, the origin of Chan antinomianism, if there was such a thing, is certain understanding of Buddha nature theory. I mean, that's one way to think, is that, you know, that we are originally enlightened, and that if you realize this nature, Buddha nature, that everything you do is manifestation of truth and reality. And you can find this not just in Chan, but if you look at modern gurus, all this, whether they're, I don't know, Andrew Cohen and Hindu gurus and so on, that, you know, you are possession of truth and reality, or Sogal Rinpoche, all these scandals with Tibetan lamas and so on, that they have deep apprehension of reality, and they kind of operate from this level of awareness, and then whatever they do, at least from their perspective, is manifestation of truth and reality. It's a form of teaching and so on, if they're getting drunk or but that kind of, the kind of scandals we have today with gurus, with Zen teachers, I mean, sex, money, all these kind of unfortunate things that you probably might have heard about. We don't find too much of that in the tradition. So I don't know, but definitely the problem of interpreting Chan teachings in that antinomian terms is very, very real, which is why it's always important to be aware of the historical context. I think that's all the time we have, right?
Thank you very much, Professor, today, and your presentation, I think, make everybody happy, and it was very comprehensive and elaborate, and we all learned something about life and teaching of the Chan master Mazu Daoyi. And next week we have your third presentation, again the Thursday, next week, Thursday 26th, at the same time. So please, everyone, please join next week for this same lecture series, and you can get a better idea about more if we had some questions today, because we have now passed the time limit. So we will stop the lecture today here. And thank you, Professor, once again, and for your wonderful speech today on this topic. And we are looking forward to next week too.
Thank you very much to you for organizing, for everybody to listening. I'm sorry in terms of the structure. Conversation is more difficult online, but yeah, I hope this just opens up avenues for communication, and beyond this particular lecture series, there will be opportunities to engage, to talk, to exchange ideas. And I do hope this was helpful, and I hope that some or many of you will be able to join us next week as well. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
And once again, thank you very much for moderating. It was very helpful.
I am very.
I'm also glad to meet your acquaintance, and hopefully we will be at some point able to meet in person and talk. So I would very much like to learn more about your background in research and so on. So let's hope there will be an opportunity like that. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to leave now. So all the best. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.